Hi, it's Carolyn. I'm here to help you learn how to bake and decorate amazing cakes, and in this video I'm going to show you how to decorate this Nightmare Before Christmas cake. If you want to skip the intro and get right into the video, there are chapters linked below. So I'm starting with my cakes already baked, filled, iced, and the top two tiers are covered in fondant and they are in the refrigerator. I have videos showing you how I bake my cakes and fill them, how I frost them, how I cover them in fondant, how I refrigerate cakes. All of that is going to be linked in the description, and I will also link down there all of the tools that I use and any other videos that I reference. So let's get started. Alright guys, I have Gumtex powder or Tylose powder, CMC powder. It's basically the same thing. I sprinkle a little bit into my marshmallow fondant, knead it in there, roll it out, and let it sit. It's going to make it so much easier to work with. I only work with marshmallow fondant. I get such a good result with using marshmallow fondant. Store-bought fondant is notoriously soft and you might have a little bit of issues if you use store-bought fondant. I have a piece of non-slip pad underneath my cutting board so it doesn't slide around, an X-Acto knife with a wet paper towel, a Dresden tool, and a little bit of water. And I measured my cake and I printed these out the size that I needed it to be. I rolled out that red fondant. You saw how thick it was, and I'm doing my trace, cut, and smooth method on here. So I'm taking my Dresden tool and I am tracing that heart onto the fondant, and then I'm using this impression mat and putting that little wood impression in there, and then I'm taking my X-Acto knife and cutting the heart out, and then I am going to smooth my cut. So anytime I cut anything out of fondant, I like to take my tools, take my fingers, and smooth out those jagged edges to make it look nice and pretty. Realign that on the picture, and I'm going to repeat the process. So I have this little, is that a candle? So I'm tracing the red part on the red, and then I put that little white in the impression mat on the white part, and I'm tracing the white on there, cut it out, smooth my cuts, and I'm just going to piece that together. And getting some water on the red part where it's going to touch the white and putting that together. And then I have a star cutter and I'm doing 3 bigger ones and 2 smaller ones. And again, all the tools that I use are going to be linked in the description for you. I have some red petal dust and I'm tapping it in the jar and then on the lid to remove the excess. And I'm just coloring these in a little bit just to give them a little bit more dimension. It looks a lot better when you have the dust on there. So I'm getting some water behind the stars and sticking them down so it looks like the picture. And then I have some yellow dust and I'm coloring in the stars yellow. It's a very subtle difference, but it makes a big difference. And then I'm going to set that aside, and let's do the same thing. I'm going to color in that heart with a little bit of red, and let's set that aside. Now I'm using that impression mat on the orange, and let's do the pumpkin. So again, trace, cut, and smooth. So let's trace this pumpkin onto the orange, cut it out, and smooth my cuts. And I'm going to do the same thing for the stem, tracing that onto the brown, cut it out, and smooth my cuts. So it's trace, cut, smooth, trace, cut, smooth. That's what I'm going to do for the whole thing. So I'm going to trace the little eyes, nose, and the mouth on here and cut them out. Now I have some brown petal dust. I'm coloring in the stem and then get a little bit of water on the brown where it's going to touch the orange and stick that down. And then I have some orange petal dust, and again, just coloring this in. Do you see how much it transfers? So just a little bit goes a long way with this. And once I do that, I'm going to get a little bit of water behind the black pieces and stick that down according to the picture. And realign that on top and set that aside. And let's do the same thing for this clover. Super simple, this one. Let's trace it onto the fondant. I did put that little impression in there as well. Cut it out, smooth my cuts, realign it on top of the picture. And I have some green petal dust and I'm going to shade that in, and then we can set that aside. And let's do the same thing for the egg. The egg is a little more detailed, so I am tracing this onto the blue, and I have to get that really thin blue line there, so it's a little challenging, but you see what I'm doing, just tracing these on here, cutting them out, and then I'm doing the same thing on that yellowy orange color, making sure that I get those lines in there for the impression, and then I'm taking my Dresden tool and just deepening those lines. And doing the same thing for the burgundy section as well. Then I have that little piping tip. It's about the same size as those dots on there, so I cut 5 of those out. And then I'm doing little red dots and putting them on the white so I can get a white background, and then using a bigger piping tip to cut out a larger white circle. This will make sense as I put it together. I have a thinner piece of white fondant, and I'm just putting these on top of here according to the picture. So I have the picture close. I'm making sure that line is straight and just leaving that little white space there because there's some white in the picture, and then getting water behind all those little pieces and sticking them down. And then pressing that little impression mat on there. And I'm not cutting a border on this, so I'm just cutting this exactly along the edge and smoothing my cuts. And I'm just taking my tools and straightening that thin blue line because it did not look very nice. Now I'm getting some red dust and I'm coloring in those lines. And again, just getting some petal dust and deepening the detail in here. And then getting those little dots on the bottom as well. And that looks good. Let's set that one aside. And I did this one in a time lapse because it was taking forever. So trace it on there. I'm tracing all the pieces on the fondant, cut them out, smooth my cuts, and I'm piecing it together. And then I'm doing the same thing for the Christmas tree. Now I want to make the tree bark, so I have some cornstarch and getting that down on the countertop, get some brown fondant, and I want to roll it tall first before I roll it long, and I measured my cake to make sure I had the right height. I have that little tree bark impression mat, and I will link that in the description. I love this thing, so I'm just making sure I press that down into the fondant. The fondant is rolled out thick enough so I can press that mat in there and it won't like make a hole in the fondant. And you can see how beautiful that looks. I'm just cutting a straight edge on the bottom and a straight edge on the top. And then I just want to take my rulers and make sure that is straight. And I also measured to make sure it was tall enough so it will fit on the cake, and it is. I'm going to set that aside, and then I'm making the rings for the tree. So I have some tan fondant, and let's pop that little hole there. And I'm going to roll that out pretty thin. And using my fondant smoother to smooth it out. This is going on a 10-inch cake, so I have a 10-inch cake pan. I'm laying that on top of the fondant and using my needle tool just to trace that on there. And I'm putting that on a turntable, and I'm going to use my pizza cutter to cut that out. And once I did that, I realized it got a little distorted, so I just got the pan on there again, and I traced it on there, and I just cut that edge off. Much better. Now I need to make the rings, so I have my Dresden tool, and I am just making little rings going around the entire thing. So I'm starting on the outside, and then I'm coming up a little bit and just making little lines. Super simple. And that looks good. I'm going to set that aside. Now I want these to be 4 inches wide, so I'm making a little mark at the 4-inch, at the 8-inch, at the 12-inch, and then it's lined up at the 16. So then I'm going to flip it over, starting at the edge, mark it at 4-inch, 8, 12, and 16. This way, I'm going to cut each of these 4 inches wide. So once I did that, I'm going to line up my ruler on those 2 lines that I made and cut each piece. And I did the same thing for that other brown strip that I made, so I have 8 pieces total. And I want to make sure my cake, I needed it to be 5 3/4 inches tall, so I measured it to make sure it was the right height. I'm putting the heart down there, and I'm holding the heart in place, and I'm using my needle tool and just kind of like poking a dotted line around that heart so I know where to cut. And then I'm taking my X-Acto knife, and I'm just kind of sawing up and down through it so I don't distort the fondant. So I like to make a shallow cut in thicker fondant, and then once I have the shallow cut, I use that line as a guide to cut it out so I don't mess the fondant up. And then again, taking my tools and taking my fingers to smooth out all those jagged edges. And then I can stick the little heart right back in there. And good, let's set that aside and let's do the other one. So I have that candle, and same thing, I'm holding it down there because I don't want the candle to move as I'm tracing it. Use my needle tool and just trace it on there. And again, I'm doing the shallow cut first to get the guideline and then sticking my tip all the way down to the board and cutting this out and smoothing my cuts. So I flipped it over from the back so I can see where all that fondant is sticking out, and then flip it over again. And then I can get that little candle and stick that back in there. And crap, I forgot to make sure this was 5 3/4 inches tall. So I need to cut a little bit off the top and a little bit off the bottom to make sure that that candle is still centered. And now before I do these, I'm going to make sure it's 5 3/4 inches tall. So I just measured it and I'm cutting that little bottom part off. And then I time lapse this again. So you can see I'm putting it on there, tracing it on there, cutting it out, smoothing my cuts, and then putting the piece in the middle. So now I got to airbrush these, so I'm going to remove all those center pieces and set them aside. I love my airbrush machine. I will link that below for you. And you have to use airbrush coloring in it. There's the dial that controls the spray, the on-off switch, and I'm just going to pour a little bit of that brown in there. I have a tester, paper towel tester, so I can test the spray, and then I'm just lightly spraying this, not too much, just to get a little, bring out a little bit of the detail. I'm making sure that I get the very top and up in the middle. So I'm going to separate these so I can get the center or in between all of the pieces. And I'm doing that for the other 4 pieces as well, making sure that I get the tops and the sides and the bottom, and just spraying a little bit more on each piece just to bring out the detail in the bark. And I'm going to set that aside for about 15 to 20 minutes to dry. I got my cake out of the refrigerator. That icing is hard and solid, so I'm not going to mess it up. I'm marking an arrow so I can see the front of the cake. Take a wet paper towel to clean the cake board. And I'm just getting a little bit of water behind each of these pieces and sticking them against the side of the cake. And then I'm getting water behind the middle pieces and sticking them down as well. And that little stem fell off, so I'm going to put that on separately. Good. And using my tools and my fingers to press that all the way in there. And then I'm going to use my rulers to make sure that that is perfectly straight, and do the same thing for the next one. So I have the Christmas tree, and I'm sticking that up on the cake, making sure that it's touching the other one. Get a little bit of water behind the tree and stick that in, using my fingers and my tools to get it in place. And I'm just going to continue to do the same thing for all the rest of the pieces. I do have a little extra space in the back, so I'm just measuring. I have that little extra piece that I have, and I'm just measuring how big that piece is, and that fits in there perfectly. Get some water behind it and stick that down. And that's the back of the cake. I'm just using a dry paintbrush to remove any excess cornstarch that was on the pieces, and I'm getting a little bit of water on the very top of the cake, and then I'm going to get that circle piece and stick that down, making sure that it's pressed all the way over to the edge. And look how cool this looks. There's 5 hours of work summed up in 13 minutes. Let's put that back in the fridge. So I time-lapsed this. This was another 2 hours to make this, but I did the same trace, cut, and smooth method to make these 3 characters. And those little black lines in there, I used an edible marker. And I'm going to do the teeth detail later because it's so tiny. But, you know, I'm tracing all the pieces onto the fondant, cutting them out, smoothing my cuts, and then I put it on a piece of white fondant in the background, and I'm going to cut a white border around the entire thing. Now I'm making the dice, so I roll a ball, and then I squeeze on the top and on the side so I can kind of get it into a little cube shape. It's just my weird way of making dice, okay? This is just how I do it. If you have a mold, feel free to use that. So I have it in a ball, and then I squeeze on the top and on the sides, and then I want to refine it. So I'm pinching, pinching, pinching all of the edges just to give it a sharper look. And if you ever see me cover a cake with fondant, I do the same thing. I pinch to get a really crisp edge. I know it's weird, but I do things in a non-conventional way sometimes. And then I put it down onto that little cutting board and I smooth it out, trying to make it look all nice and pretty. And I did that for the other one as well. And then I'm going to take an edible marker. I forgot to film it, but I do just take a little edible marker and put the little dots of the dice on there. So let's set that aside. Now I'm going to airbrush this. So that cake is covered in fondant. I have videos showing you how I cover cakes in fondant, and I will link that in the description. I find it so much better to airbrush on fondant rather than buttercream. I just feel like the result is so much better. So I'm getting a little bit of black airbrush along the bottom, and then I want a kind of ombre effect, so I'm doing it heavier at the bottom and then lighter as it goes up to the cake, so it's kind of fading from purple down to black. And that looks good. Let's put that back in the fridge so that ink can dry. So I measured my cake and I printed Jack out the size that I wanted him to be, and I rolled that white fondant out a little bit thicker, and I'm doing the same trace, cut, and smooth technique on here, making sure that I get the inner details as well. And then peel that back, and I'm going to use my tools, and for the nostrils and the eyes I want to push the fondant down, so when I put the black pieces on there, they're not sitting on top of the fondant. It looks a lot better if it's set into the fondant. So I just need to use my ball tools and my fingers just to press that fondant down. And that's why I rolled the fondant out a little thicker, so I could press it down and get this detail in here. So I'm just taking my Dresden tool and I'm deepening the inner detail lines. And then I'm taking my black edible marker, and it's kind of like drawing eyeliner. You're doing very, very light strokes, and I'm just doing it in little sections, and it doesn't look good at first. We'll make it look a lot better, but you see how the lines go across the entire thing, but I'm doing it in like half sections. So I'm doing the upper part and then the lower part. And then I'm using the thicker end. So I started with the thinner end of the marker, and now I'm using the thicker end just to deepen that line. So I'm using a very light hand because this fondant is soft, so I don't want to press too hard or I'm going to drag the fondant as I draw on it. And then I have some thin black fondant, so again, trace, cut, and smooth. So let's trace these eyes and the nostrils on here, cut them out, and I'm going to get a little bit of water behind each piece and stick them down on that white piece. So as I stick those black pieces down in there, I'm using my ball tools and just pressing them down there to make sure that they are set in that white fondant and not just sticking out on top. And same thing for the eyes. Let's get a little bit of water behind each of those, and then I'm going to use my ball tools and really just make sure those edges are pressed down into the white part. And those edges were jagged and it was annoying me, so I was just cleaning them up. So again, since this is a thicker piece of fondant, why is that so hard to say? I'm using the tip of that knife to make a guideline, and then once I have the guideline, I stick it all the way down to the cutting board to cut this out. And then I'm using a ribbon cutter just to cut the neck, and I'm going to set that aside. And then I want to take my fingers and smooth this out. So I'm just rounding out that edge so it wasn't so straight and sharp. And I'm using my tools to deepen the inner details. And now I'm doing the bow tie. And here's an example of where sometimes you have to look past the picture. So it's cut off on this picture, and I just have to figure out where I want it to go. So I'm creating an imaginary line there, and then doing another one on the bottom. So I'm using the picture as a guide, but not necessarily tracing exactly where it is. I hope this makes sense. But if I traced it the way it was in the picture, it would not have sat on the top of the cake as well. So again, I'm doing the really shallow cut, and then I cut the whole thing out, and I'm smoothing it with my fingers, and then I'm doing the same thing for the little, I guess that's a cat, right? The cat head, and smoothing my cuts, and then I cut those little white eyes out. And again, I'm using my ball tools to stick them down into the black piece and trimming the neck so that cat piece fits onto it. Perfect. And then I just have some black pebble dust, and I'm lightly coloring in his face. And now I have some Wilton white, I guess it's white icing coloring, and I'll link that in the description. And I have a really thin paintbrush and a non-shaky hand, and I hold my breath the entire time I do this. And I'm just looking at the picture and drawing these lines on, and I set that aside to dry. Now I'm making Oogie Boogie, and I have this little textured burlap roller. I don't think they still make that anymore. I could try, you could use a real piece of burlap and just a rolling pin on top. But again, I rolled that fondant out pretty thick, and I'm just tracing this on here. And once I trace it on there, I use my Dresden tool just to deepen the detail. And I want to press that mouth in because I want to put that black piece sinking down into it like we did with Jack. And then I'm tracing the eyes and the mouth onto the black fondant. Let's cut out those pieces and get a little bit of water behind it. And then, again, I'm using my tools to press that down into the fondant. And same thing for the mouth. And then I'm doing my shallow cut, and then I'm going to cut the entire thing out. And once that's cut out, I'm going to flip it over and use my fingers and smooth it from the back and flip it over again. And I'm pulling those feet up, so it's going to kind of look like he's standing on top of the cake. Right, and then I'm using my Dresden tool just to make those lines in there, and I'm using that burlap impression on the back. And I want to make his eyebrows, so I'm rolling a ball into like a little point on one end and then pressing it down into that burlap impression. Get a little bit of water behind it and stick it down. I did that for both of the eyebrows. And I'm just using an edible marker again to make these details around the mouth. And I have some skewers in here. You want to twist it in, don't jab it in, and I'm just twisting it on either side. I'm going to do 2 skewers. However, that is a little too soft right now, so I'm going to wait until he hardens up a little bit, and then I'll stick those skewers in there. So I'm just making a little more line details in here, and I'm going to set him aside to dry. So now I have some thin white fondant, and I'm cutting these strips out here. I'm making the name and the number. I will link this strip cutter down in the description. But do you see how I'm just like using my hands and pressing it against there to make sure I have some clean cuts on there? And I'm cutting a bunch of black and white stripes. Sometimes I like to use my Dresden tool to really make sure the fondant is pressed in there and I get clean cuts. And I did that a bunch of times, so I have a bunch of black and white stripes. And now I have this number 3, so I printed that out the size that I want it to be. And I'm going to trace the 3 onto the white fondant so I know where to put the stripes. I'm getting a little bit of water on there. And I want to do vertical stripes, so I'm alternating black and white, sticking them to that wet white fondant, making sure I cover the entire 3 that I just traced. And once I have that on there, I'm going to lay the 3 down on top, and I'm using my needle tool, and I'm doing the little pinprick method to get a dotted line that I'm going to follow to cut this out. If I use my Dresden tool, I could have messed up or distorted the line, so I like to use the pinprick method. Then I have some thicker purple fondant. I'm getting a little bit of water behind the 3 and sticking that down, making sure those stripes are perfectly vertical, and I'm doing a shallow cut first, and then I'm going to cut this out of the fondant. And you see how those inner pieces are a pain in the butt, so I have to work kind of slow, and I'm kind of pulling that fondant away so I don't mess it up. And then once I have that cut out, flip it over, smooth it with my fingers from the back and then from the front. And I'm going to stick a skewer in the bottom of that as well. I just want to set that aside to dry. Now I'm measuring where the name is going to go, so I'm just getting a little bit of water down, and again alternating black and white vertical stripes, and then I'm going to stick the name down on top, use the pinprick method, and trace all of the letters. Make sure you get the center pieces as well. I always want to cut out the center pieces first and smooth them with my tools, and then I'm going to cut the rest of the letters out. Carefully removing the fondant so I don't mess this up, and then I'm just cleaning these up and using my fingers and my tools to smooth out the jagged edges. I have a thin piece of purple fondant, and I'm getting some water behind each of them and sticking that down on there, and then I'm cutting an even border around all the letters as well, and then using my tools and my fingers to smooth out those cuts. And I'm going to set that aside to dry. And I got that out of the refrigerator. Let's stack the cake. So measure the straw. You stick it down in there and see where it's touching the top of the cake and snip that off. And then I'm measuring the other straws against that first straw, if that makes any sense. I have a video where I show you how to stack cakes, and I will link that in the description. It goes into full detail. I wash my hands, stack that next layer on, make sure it's level. Then I'm using my little sewing ruler and making sure I'm marking these to the correct height, and then I cut that marker off and stick the straws in the cake and get a little bit more icing down, and then I'm going to stick that top tier on top and dowel through the center, and I'm going to fill that with some buttercream and put a piece of fondant on top. Now I want to anchor this into the cake, so I'm getting some toothpicks down behind it. It's going to hook on there like a picture hook, so it's not going to fall off. So you see how those toothpicks are angling up? I get some icing behind it, and then I push that down on there onto the toothpick so that it won't fall off of the cake. And then I'm getting the neck on, so I got a little bit of icing behind that as well, and behind that little cat face. And then I got some icing behind the part of that bow tie that is going to stick to the cake. And then I'm holding that up there, and I'm seeing where it's touching the cake. So I'm going to pull that out and get a little bit of icing behind it and then stick that back on. So that dried overnight. So it dried really stiff and it's holding its shape. So I have an icing bag with a tip number 2, and I'm carefully adding these teeth in here. I'm barely squeezing any icing out. And then I'm getting some piping gel behind the name, and I'm going to stick that to the bottom part of that little tub that they're in. So upset my camera stopped filming, but I will talk in the outro about what I did with the rest of the cake. But here is the finished product. How adorable is this? So I am so sorry that my camera cut out and I didn't get the rest of this on film. So let me explain to you what I did for the rest of this design. For Oogie Boogie, I actually got some brown petal dust and I shaded in, I colored them in a little bit like I did with those other pieces. And I put 2 skewers underneath him. And once the fondant hardened a little bit, it was easier to get the skewers in there without distorting the fondant. So there are 2 skewers in Oogie Boogie, and I stuck him in the top of the cake. And I did the same thing for the number 3. I got a skewer underneath it, and with the numbers, I always put a toothpick next to the skewer. That way it doesn't twist when it goes in the top of the cake, and I stuck that down there too. And I believe I mentioned with the dice, I just took an edible marker and I just put the dots on the dice. Super simple. Now they asked for this specific design. They wanted the trees on the bottom tier. They wanted lock, shock, and barrel on the middle. They wanted Jack on the top and Oogie Boogie on as the topper. And that I executed their design. If I personally wanted to make this cake, I would have included Sally. I made Sally on a cake before and I just loved the way that it looked. I just liked making her, and also the patchwork background. I think that it would have added a little more visual interest, but they didn't want Sally on the cake at all, so we stuck with this design. And I gotta be honest with you guys, I tried to make Oogie Boogie in 3D, and this, I'm telling you, I'm good at what I do. This is why I stick with 2D figures. I tried to make Oogie Boogie 3D. And I took a picture of it because it's so embarrassing. What is this? What in the Harry Potter sorting hat Oogie? It's like Oogie Boogie's long distant cousin. You know, like, what is this? I was laughing so hard and I was like, I need to not do this. I tried to like form it out of Rice Krispies and cover it in fondant. I've done that before for the Harry Potter sorting hat and it looks so much better than I just didn't get right. So this is why I stick with the 2D figures. But I thought you guys would get a kick out of that because sometimes you just gotta laugh at yourself. So this cake, the top tier is a 2-layer torted 5-inch. The middle tier is a 2-layer torted 7-inch. And the bottom tier is a 3-layer not torted 9-inch. And I have a video where I talk about when I tort and when I don't tort my cakes, and I will link that in the description. But the reason I did a 3-layer 9-inch on the bottom tier is so it was a little taller and I had more room for the decorations. And it feeds about 60 to 70 people. And just a quick note, the bottom tier, just doing the trees and that whole thing took 5 hours. It took forever to do. And I think I also mentioned in the video, the lock, shock, and barrel, those two-dimensional figures, that took another 2 hours. So just those figures and that bottom tier was 7 hours. And to decorate this entire cake was probably upwards of like 13 to 15 hours. So I think that's it. What new techniques did you learn in this video? I would love to know. Leave it in the comments below. And just a reminder, I do have a Cake Academy membership program. There are 3 tiers to the memberships. I'm going to link all that information in the description for you. Please like this video if you liked it, and if you are enjoying my tutorials, I would be so grateful if you could buy me a coffee. My link is in the description. And I would love it if you would keep in touch on socials, and you could check out my website. And if you want to stick around, you can watch this video next and hit subscribe and the bell if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys. And remember, it's cake. Have fun. I will see you on the next one. Bye.